Very special for South Florida PBS to be here this evening to preview the documentary Crossing Overtown. We're excited to have the filmmakers with us and some of the stars of the film. You probably all know them very well. So we want to thank the Historic Black Police Precinct Courthouse and Museum tonight for hosting us this evening. Also want to thank the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau for helping make this film possible. With us tonight are our filmmakers, Scott Barnett and Joanna Vega. We hope that you will all stick around after we show the screener, because we're going to have a wonderful conversation with Scott and Chief Delrish Moss and a couple of the historians that you'll see in the film. So Isaac, if you would.
The Negro Uplift Association, as far back as 1919, right after the end of World War I, were asking for black policemen. And the rationale was that white policemen aren't very prudent the way they treat a lot of black suspects. You know, we need some black patrolmen for our area. And eventually in 1944, we would get the first 5 black patrolmen.
1944 would see the implementation of an all-black police force in order to provide Overtown with local patrolmen familiar with the area. While not given full authority, these patrolmen would bring some semblance of peace to the community.
When the first 5 came on in 1944, this was a call to see more representation, less lives being snuffed out. Blacks were not seeing justice. They weren't seeing courtrooms. They were disappearing. This was another way to see some form of justice.
This is the only colored court in the history of America, anywhere in America. Not Alabama, not Mississippi, not South Carolina, Miami, Florida.
To see this building is to know that there is hope for justice for all.
We have joining us tonight, we have Chief Delrish Moss, and we have Dr. Paul George from Miami History.
Good to see you.
And I'm going to turn things over to Scott. With that said.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is quite an honor and privilege to be with these 2 men. I do want to say first, I want to acknowledge Terrence back there in the room. I came here many years ago. I work in film and TV, and it was actually the Miami-Dade Film Office that was looking for a jail. And the Miami-Dade Film Office said, well, there's the black police precinct, and honestly, didn't really know what the name meant, but you know, it was a nice, if you saw the courthouse, it's a beautiful courthouse. And so when I first came and met Terrence, we sat and talked for a while about what this building means, and I personally came to this not knowing the full story. From Miami, my father's side of the family is from Miami as well, and you know, you hear little stories here and there, but I remember just being many years ago in the City Miami Police Department, saw some of the pictures on the wall, the historic pictures, and you're like, this is not the Miami I know, this is the Old South. And, you know, you start looking at those pictures and you start understanding that story. I think Terrence led me to Delrish and was trying to find, you know, somebody who had a certain tie to Overtown, and indeed, Delrish Moss has a very strong tie. He's from Overtown. And just to introduce Delrish and his background, which he could do for himself, but I want to honor him. His family actually goes back to the original Bahamians here in Miami. That was the community that was here even before Miami was a city. Actually, that was one of the original communities. They came here and started farms. And I'm about to go into history stuff, and I've got Dr. George here, so it's very intimidating. But Delrish, he became a City of Miami police officer. The film, when you watch the film, you'll understand why. He was there, City of Miami Police, for many years, became the police information officer, the media, everybody in Miami knew him. When the murder of Michael Brown happened in 2014 in Ferguson, it was a very interesting situation because you had an all-white police department and a majority black community. So after the Michael Brown incident, there was a need to really reform the department. Delrish came in and became chief of police there, and he spent a few years working, we'll get into that, working to reform that department. And eventually Delrish came back to Miami. He recently was working at FIU as a captain, right?
Yes.
As a captain at FIU, working with the students at Florida International University. And he recently retired from that position because more recently,
Yeah. So they actually announced today I'm the new police chief in the city of Miramar.
So it's just a privilege to be next to this man, and he is a part of history. So, to touch history like that, I'm going to touch him. But it's very rare that there are these iconic people in our history as a people that, define that story. And Delrish is one of those people. Long after I'm gone, his story will remain. My story will remain with my family over there, but his story will remain with the community at large. He will be not just the story of Miami, but the story of all of us. Talking about icons, obviously, I have my friend Dr. Paul George, who is himself an icon of Miami. I worked with Dr. George back went on one of his tours. We were just talking about that. And back in '92, I did a documentary about the history of Fort Lauderdale, and Dr. George gave me the opportunity to host that program, and we had a lot of fun doing that. And we've been friends for many years, and whenever I have any questions, it's amazing the knowledge this man has in his head. It's just, he's got a depth of knowledge like none other. But I wanted to say that in light of a lot of things that we see today in terms of history and honoring history and people wanting to, edit history, history matters. History matters. And it's important that we understand the story not from just one perspective, but from many perspectives. I was reminded of a friend of mine long time ago, back in the 1970s, who he was attending Florida State University. He was a history major. And what's very interesting, what he chose as a topic, and I have it right here, I printed it out. So this gentleman did a story, it's called Policing Miami's Black Community. This is 1977, think about this. The story of Black Miami wasn't being told really anywhere, and we do have people to thank in the city, Dr. Fields and her archive, and other people who are doing the area. But think about this, 1977, there was this gentleman who did a thesis, and it was called Policing Miami's Black Community from 1896 to 1930. That person who wrote that, was it 1977? It was Dr. George. Dr. George was telling this story a long time ago, and so when I first was doing research for this film, this was one of the first places I went to, was this wonderful article. And with that, maybe Dr. George, I'm not going to put you on the spot here, but tell us what brought you to that story, and tell us a little bit about that early time period of Miami and your perspective on that, if you don't mind.
Well, it's such an eye-opener. I got my master's and PhD at Florida State in history, and for my master's thesis, I wrote a thesis on Philadelphia's politics in the Gilded Age. My parents came from Philadelphia, and it was a huge city, at that point. And they had a strong Republican machine. I really enjoyed the topic. And so I came back for my doctorate in the 70s, and I was going to continue, I was just going to expand on that, but I hadn't registered the topic. So somebody from Yale and somebody from Case Western were already writing on parts of what I had written for my thesis. So I had to do something else. And I was destitute like all graduate students at that time. And, the grants weren't around and what have you. I'd run out of scholarship money completely. So I said, well, my parents are in Miami. I grew up here. And I'm a urban historian. Maybe I should write on something on Miami. And I had this wonderful directing professor, and I was really interested in the, and knew hardly anything about Miami history, just virtually nothing. So I wanted to write about the politics of Miami in the 1930s and 1940s. This was almost like, just a shot in the dark. And so my professor said, well, that sounds good. And so I started doing some research, and he never really pushed me on it. And one thing led to another, and I was over in Europe, and it just wasn't working. So he took a position, he got an endowed chair at a college in Georgia, and this man who had taught me urban American history now became my directing professor. He said, police histories are hot. You need to do something like that. And he said, what do you think about Pensacola? I said, no, my parents live in Miami. I have no money. I can live there and do my research. So long story short, we chose Miami and its police in the 1920s, which was this huge period in terms of a boom. Miami's population in 1920 was a little bit under 30,000. In 1925, at the peak of the real estate boom, it was unofficially about 150,000. All, Miami Shores was developed, Coral Gables, it just goes on and on. So, but I was at Florida State because suddenly I'd gotten this teaching fellowship to teach a couple classes each semester for the next year or so. So I started researching on Florida State, and they had virtually everything I needed. They had on microfilm the Miami Herald, every edition. They had Miami News. You could get stuff in those days called interlibrary loan stuff, things you couldn't get within the library itself. And so I started researching it, and I got through the 20s. I spent many, many months on that, and I turned to my professor and said, this story of Miami is so outrageous. Can I go back to the beginning in 1896 and just bring it up to 1930? He said, yeah, why don't you do that? So I did, and I had to think about chapters. So, there was an overview, chapter 1, and then there was the police from 1896 to 1907, when my police department actually emerged what was called the city marshal. And then 1907 to 1921, when it became a more professional force, from 21 to 1930. Then there's other topics within that. How about traffic, which was, the place was impassable at the time. How about African Americans in the police? And it just hadn't been written on before. And I remember when I turned that chapter to my directing professor, he was incredulous. The bigotry and the violence perpetrated by white police on black residents. And he passed it around in the department to different professors, one of whom was an African American and a good friend of mine, Bobby Hall, who was working on his doctorate too. And I just couldn't believe it, what was going on. So I finished the thing, and there were no jobs in history. I was waiting on tables the night before I defended my dissertation. I was waiting on tables the night after I defended my dissertation. There was no jobs. So, essentially you had to publish. And one thing led to another, and I started getting teaching jobs here, there, and everywhere. And I was publishing a lot, and one of the early articles was on Overtown, called Colored Town initially in general, and another was on police in Miami's black community. And then with, some of you all know him, the late, great Judge Tom Peterson. We wrote a piece on Liberty Square, and through that examined the history of Liberty City. And so one thing led to another, and that's what kind of got me into all this. But it's just been an unbelievable journey. And then to be here to see this is just amazing. It really is. And again, going through every day, we didn't have the internet then, so going through every day of 2 newspapers and police reports, whatever I get my hands on, in order to get stuff. And I remember the cry in 1919 after World War I on the part of the Negro Uplift Association. As you mentioned, Scott, I believe, we need policemen for our quarter. And the implication was, we're not being treated right. And you could look at every month, at the end of the month, there'd be a record of the arrests in Miami, say 1905 or 1915, 1920. There might be 30 to 50 people arrested before Miami really grew during the boom. And probably out of, say, 30 arrests in 1914, for, say, March of 1914, about 26 to 27 were African Americans. How's that possible when only 20% of the population was black at the time? Obviously, they were coming over here and doing these things. So, it was just so obvious. Jim Crow, Miami. That's why, to see Chief Dixon or Chief Moss is just a fantastic progression for us.
One of the things that we learned about this story, what's very interesting is, Miami, well, obviously, I'm not going to get into the whole story of this area going back to the Spanish. Obviously, we know the different multicultural influences on this area going back over 500 years. Obviously, the original Miami was a mix, and as Flagler's Railroad came down here, that brought a lot of laborers. A lot of them were black, there were some white, but there were a lot of black. A lot of the Bahamians participated in that. And those people that built this city, not just the railroad, but the hotels and the foundations, I mean, the people who were doing the heavy burden of building the city, obviously they needed a place to live, so they lived in Miami. One of the interesting things in the film that Dr. George points out is the fact that when Miami was kind of a frontier town in the late 19th century, people lived together. There wasn't segregation so much as because there wasn't, I mean, there was very few people down here. So essentially, as far as we understand.
Yeah, there wasn't incorporation, so you didn't have municipal laws that would separate the races. Once incorporation came in 1896, then you have laws separating the races.
Yeah.
But you had farming communities in Lemon City and in Coconut Grove, and you really hit the nail on the head with the Bahamian thing. You know, it's a best kept secret in Miami history. But if you look at the U.S. Census in 1920, Miami had the second largest number, not percentage, second largest number of West Indian people after New York City. Why? Because of the black and white Bahamians here. There was a little Bahamian community, a black Bahamian community in today's Little Havana between the Expressway, which is 4th Avenue and 8th Avenue, from 11th Street, which was part of the southern border of Miami, crossing 8th Street, and it was called South Miami. And they were, in all likelihood, most of them were workers for the Brickell properties. Now, the Brickels owned thousands of acres of land south of the river. They began buying land in 1871. So you had South Miami, and it sort of grew organically. And then the city leaders, which was the white leadership in 1912, said, we can't have this because they're right next to a white community. We're going to try to move them. Listen to this, how crazy it is. We're going to try to move them over to Colored Town. But there was a case in Louisville, Kentucky at that time. The same kind of thing was tried, and there was an ordinance passed, and the ordinance was taken to court, and the court threw out the ordinance, so they couldn't do it otherwise. But South Miami was still a black community into the 1940s in a part of today's Little Havana, and just west of it was what's called Conch Hill. It was a white Bahamian community. So the Bahamian presence here was just phenomenal.
So what I try to do with the film is I try to explain the you know, where we're coming from Reconstruction, okay? Reconstruction was a time period when all of a sudden, in the late 19th centuries, blacks started to have representation in this country. They were represented in Congress. They were represented in all parts of society. And it seemed to be that, you know, progress was really happening. And not to get into the politics of it all, but it really, one of the things that was very interesting about this film for me was seeing the relationship between federal and state control issues. And, you know, we're seeing some of that right now. We're not going to get into it, but you know, as we develop the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, everything seemed to be going well. But then the states realized, oh, we have ways to circumvent these laws, and poll taxes, and the ban on interracial marriage, and just different black codes that were developed over time. I don't want to get into all that because we're getting off track here. But one of the reasons I want to talk about that is because what seems to be a recurring theme, and Archie McKay actually says in the film, is Miami's always been a progressive city, and one of the reasons that it's a progressive city is the fact that you had the Old South here, but then you had this northern population, so you had this interesting mix that allowed for certain things to happen over many years, culminating in the 1960s with a lot of the civil rights organizations in the United States, the NAACP, CORE, the Committee on Racial Equality. They came down here to Miami. Miami was a proving ground. So a lot of the early civil rights movements, this is something we really need to be proud of, happened well before, you know, and it's not to take away from anything from Rosa Parks, that was 1954, and Emmett Till, 1954, but we had the Wade-In of Oliver Beach in 1945, okay? When we talk about, Dr. George talks about this in the film, the students at Greensboro in 1960, we had sit-ins happening here in 1959, and we have in wonderful archives of the Wilson Archives, we have film of all these things happening. But so that's one of the very interesting themes of this film. All throughout the centuries, there was always this strife between black and white communities, whether it be the people of Overtown overgrowing their area and having to move west into Liberty City, which was a majority white at the time, and there were a lot of people had problems with it. All of a sudden there was a black population moving into the areas. You had some riots. I think in 1959 there was a Liberty City riot. You know, when we talk about, when I grew up here in Miami and I heard about these riots, you really don't know what the story is. You just heard, oh, there's some riots going on in Liberty City, there's some riots going on in Overtown, and people just think these people are just rioting for no reason. They just like to riot, that's what they do. Not realizing that there's a backstory there, whether it's McDuffie being murdered, whether it's Neville Johnson being murdered. These people, even in 1959, there was a riot, if I'm correct, in Liberty City for the fact that the black population is moving into that area. And so there's a story behind these things. And that's one of the wonderful things about all of these stories and all the historians and to tell these stories. But I know I'm going off kilter here, and I want to get to my man right here. Delrish Moss, let's talk about, tell us everything about your life when you grew up in about 5 minutes. Tell us about where you're originally from and how that story progressed.
Yeah, so my family's originally from Coconut Grove, or from the Bahamas, and by way of Coconut Grove, but eventually, through a number of different sets of happenstance, really, we ended up Overtown. And while living Overtown, we didn't have a great relationship with police. They weren't very good to us. And it was actually on the aftermath of at least 2 of those encounters that made me say, well, if that's the best service that we're getting for a community, it's probably best that I throw my name in the hat, if you will, and help to provide that service. And during the course of that, I got to meet some pretty interesting and dynamic people. I want to say Chief Najee back there, who is the first female police assistant chief with the city of Miami. And Leroy Smith, I got to meet his sons over here, who was the first black man ever on command staff in the police department, and actually helped start what was called Operation Badge, that actually led to an increase in the number of police officers around the 1970s coming on to the police department. But it wasn't until I ran into Edward Topps Kimball and Ralph White, who were 2 of the original 5, joined by, at that time when they started, Moody Hall, John Millich, Clyde Lee were the other 3. But I got to meet these 2 who were the last survivors of that first 5. And it wasn't until we were doing a Black History Month program that they actually brought me to this location, where I played right there at the basketball courts right under the expressway, which was the original Range Park, named after Athlete Range. So we used to play there and go to the jams there. And I didn't know what this building was. And it wasn't until my conversation with them, plus so many black officers who became like mentors for me, that I started to develop an interest in the history of the department, because I had no clue. And that's one of the important things about history. History helps you, it's sort of a compass bearing. It helps you figure out where you are and how you can move to the future. So that's why it's so important not to snuff out history or stop it from happening. There's my soapbox there. But those things all helped me to decide what I wanted to do with regard to the future. And of course, I retired in 2016 and took the call to Ferguson, in large part because in the 1980s, when Neville Johnson was killed, I was outside. He was a friend of mine. His brother Alfonso and I went to high school together. When all these things happened, we were right there, affected by what was happening. I remember putting towels under the door, because I had my great-grandmother living in the house on 8th Street, in the apartment on 8th Street, where she suffered from all sorts of respiratory sicknesses, and tear gas was just coming through. So all of these things helped me not only to decide what I wanted to do, but it also informed my career as I've moved through law enforcement.
Something that's not in the film, but when I spent time with Delrish, you know, he told me about, you know, the process and joining Ferguson. You know, tell us a little bit about what you were presented with when you first, and if everybody, just so everybody's familiar with, in 2014, a young man named Michael Brown was killed by the Ferguson police. I wouldn't say that's where Black Lives Matter started, but it kind of took off, as you say.
Yeah.
Right, on the national scene. And so that department was looking for reform. You were telling me earlier about the selection process.
Yeah. So they basically did a national search for a police chief, and it was actually on the heels of kind of an offhanded joke, really, in one of the, we call them chiefs meetings, where certain majors and assistant chiefs met with the then Miami chief, and in that I developed a sort of curiosity. I was working in community relations at the time, and I ended up putting in for the job that night without even thinking about it, because as I started to look at some of the things that were happening in Ferguson, they were so reminiscent of what was going on in Miami. And I'll be honest with you, and Stanley can tell you, I didn't think I'd get the job. You were shocked? Yeah. Yeah, I didn't think I'd get the job. There were essays that we had to do on certain positions, and after that, there was this huge questionnaire that asked you all manner of questions. And I think initially 54 of us put in for the job from all around the country. And then I was off vacation and in Texas when I got a call saying, "Hey, we've looked at your essays, we've looked at your questionnaire, we've looked at that. We're inviting you to Ferguson to actually interview." And I'm like, "What, me? You sure?" And I went through, and it was 4 days of 3 interviews a day. You go back to the hotel at night, and then you got the call saying you were invited back the next day or you weren't. And so we're going through that process, and then after that process, we did 2 town hall meetings. It was down to 4 of us, and then we had a one-on-one with the city manager. And I came back and I told the people who I worked with in community relations that, "Hey, just want you to know I put in for Ferguson, thinking my name and Ferguson and the enormity of that situation, you're probably going to hear about it," so I didn't want them to be surprised. And I can't say they were very happy that I put in. I think they were happy if I got it, happy for me, but not happy because of the separation, because I had a really good team of people working with me. And I got it. And so, you know, you get to the swearing in day, and, you know, there's all the pomp and circumstances of a swearing in, which was great. But we walked right outside of the police department, and I was met with protest. There was a group greeting me, and there was another group saying, "Hey, go home. We don't want you here." And the challenge became helping to to unite those groups, at least in a fashion well enough that we could get some police reform done in a positive fashion. And so that was the journey to Ferguson.
You did have some pushback within the department itself.
Oh, definitely. So my junior senior staff member on the department had been there 43 years. And so you can imagine all the things that he had grown very accustomed to. In fact, I forbade them telling me this is the way we've always done it, because if it didn't make sense, we're not going to continue. And I had to have an actual meeting with them because of that pushback, and runs to the city council was divided. There were people on the city council who didn't want me there. There were people on the city council who wanted me there but didn't. So they were helpful, others weren't. There were always issues, but it wasn't so much about me. It was about the divide that was happening in the city. And for me, having seen that in Miami in the 80s, having seen some of the things that we went through, was like, oh, all my life was preparing me for this moment, because I got to see these things sort of firsthand. So I think they were often surprised that no matter what they threw at me, we came out doing well. And I would have actually renewed my contract and stayed there longer had it not been for the fact that my mother suffered a stroke, and I thought it's time to return home.
So it's very interesting, because think about that story of Miami, from the original Bahamians all the way, you know, to Delrish and his career. He's carrying that entire history on his shoulders to inform another city about the best way to move forward. And what's remarkable about the city, and I know we're not perfect, but is this focus on community policing. You see it now in the city of Miami. You see resource officers. When I was doing the film, I was over here at Williams Park filming the 9U football Optimist League over here. And it was interesting because there were 2 officers that came to the field, and they were not there for any other reason except they're in the community. And that's one of the things when we talk about that Overtown has taught lessons, not for just the city, but for the nation. You know, Overtown, because of the challenges that it went through, found solutions to make things work in a better way. And one of those solutions was to have their officers actually be a part of the community because they knew each other. And I think that was your experience, right? That talk about community policing and what that means.
So, you know, community policing in large regard is something Miami sort of formulated, but it wasn't something so foreign to Miami. Meaning, in my days as a homicide detective, I solved cases not because I was a brilliant homicide detective, because I won't tell you that lie, but it was because of relationships. And those relationships paid dividends in terms of being able to get information, being able to find people, being able to add, being able to do things that would actually help to solve crime, because we don't do this by ourselves. I always say we police at the pleasure of the people. But in that policing at the pleasure of the people, we have to remember to whom much is given. Police officers exercise a lot of power. To whom much is given, much is required. And so part of that is to work with and give back to the community. And I learned that in Miami. It was a foreign concept when I got to Ferguson. It was a foreign concept when I was on the board of directors for the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and we were traveling different cities and looking at different things. And Miami informed me thus that there were always things that I could add to the conversations in other cities. And this is, while we're not perfect, this is probably the greatest training ground in the world. I mean, we have made police chiefs, not just in Ferguson, Rochester, New York, parts of Tennessee, Memphis Schools Police, North Carolina, you name it. Miami is creating police chiefs that are, and exporting this talent across the country that's helping to add to what is policing in America.
Dr. George, if you can give us a little bit of your perspective on, you know, how that history formed, especially during the civil rights movement. There were things going on here in Miami that would prove to be a model for the rest of the country in some ways. Maybe if you could expound on that.
Well, it's a best kept secret how Miami was really right at the top of the civil rights movement. You can go back to the late 40s and see that. And it goes back partly to black soldiers coming back here and saying, you know, we just put our lives on the line in the Pacific or in Europe and we're getting kicked around here. That was one reaction. That happened in other places too. Another was the collaboration between black civil rights leaders in terms of civil rights activities and many clerics, whether they were Jewish or Catholic or Protestant. You had a lot of that. In fact, there were bombings of synagogues and there were unlit sticks of dynamite on the steps of a Catholic church as far back as 1951, protesting this civil rights activity. And it was a collaboration in many ways, which is so fascinating. The police thing is interesting. The black patrolmen was such a landmark breakthrough. Until that time, there just wasn't any hope. If you got pulled over by a policeman, a white policeman, you know, everything was up for grabs.
Yeah.
But I think that breakthrough was great. And then by the early 1950s, 1951, the city of Miami had more than 50 black policemen, which was larger in numbers than any other city in the South at that time. So there was progress in that respect. And again, we desegregated the police department, I believe in 1963. And of course, you have one of the chiefs in the video, as you're seeing,
Yeah.
which is just fantastic. I mean, he came aboard and he kind of bridged that whole thing. So I think the civil rights movement here was very advanced compared to a lot of other places. I think in many ways the growth of black policemen was far ahead of most southern cities at that time, all the way into the 1960s and beyond. I think those are really good models for it. Having Judge Lawson Thomas, what an icon he was, not just as a judge and as an independent attorney, but as a civil rights leader. He was the guy that sort of orchestrated the swim-in at Haulover Beach in the spring of 1945 that led to the creation of Virginia Key Beach as a black segregated beach. But having him up here was phenomenal. As well as another colleague, I can't remember his name now, there was another judge also who...
John Johnson.
Johnson, yes, who collaborated with him. So I think, Scott, as you seem to be implying, there were a lot of leadership qualities and a lot of progressivism on the part of the police here, prompted in a large measure by not only black police, but the civil rights movement. And we'll see a lot of that in the video.
What you may or may not realize in this film is the three officers, including Delrish with Clarence Dixon and with Archie McKay, that's 3 generations. Just an incredible story. And I know that meant a lot to you to be with these officers and what they meant for you. I mean, you knew them, you knew what they were doing when these things were happening. Dixon.
Yeah, what was really magical about that moment for me is Chief Dixon handed me my badge. There's a picture of me in my house receiving my badge. He wasn't even the chief, Breslow was the chief, but Dixon handed me my badge. That was very important. Archie McKay I got to know through a volunteer we had at the department. Her name was Josie Poitier. Josie had been a volunteer since she was like 13 years old with the police department. And I mean, I'm not talking about a part-time volunteer. I'm talking about 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. You call Josie, Josie got things. And so Josie actually helped me meet a lot of people, Archie McKay, and so many others. And Josie also, having been on the department or a volunteer in the department with that history, also helped to inform my knowledge of these things. And it makes you feel really, really big to know that you are the product of all of this hard work and all of the strife and all of those things they went through. It really makes you feel important. You know, if you ever saw the movie Amistad, there's a scene in there where Senkei is going before the Supreme Court and they ask him, are you afraid? And he says, no, I'm not afraid. He says, because I will call to my ancestors far back to the beginning of time and they will come, because at this moment I'm the single reason they ever existed in the first place. That's how powerful that moment was for me.
What people don't understand, this building, you know, in the state that it's in, is here not because some city official or some history person. These were the retired officers in Miami who saved this building. So I do want to acknowledge the board here. They helped get this building back into the right state. They spent hundreds of hours to make this building happen, to maintain this history. So it's very special to be here. And what can we look forward to as the chief is a new chief in a new city, a new town. So what can we look forward to in the future here?
You know, while I lived in Miramar on 2 different stints, I'm still at the point where I'm finding the bathrooms in the building. But one of the things that will be a part of whatever I do in Miramar is the knowledge that I got here, the things that I learned here, and of course things that I learned through Ferguson and so forth. So I will be taking all of that history, that knowledge into my new experiences as I meet with Miramar police officers and learn some of their history so that we can kind of put those things together and fashion where we go. But it's a growing, progressive city, and I'm looking forward to being a part of that. And you know, a lot of Miramar residents are former Miami residents, so I get calls, I've been getting calls as the rumor has been out there. You're our chief now. We know where you came from, and and we'll be watching what you do. Yeah. So,
yeah, as a matter of fact, I have a speeding ticket. Dr. George, any last words about this history and the wonderful resources that we have here in History Miami, and just people want to explore that history? Just
on a personal note, you know, the good luck I had to somehow choose a police topic. I had this very savvy professor, as I mentioned to you. You can get these things published, and that was a big thing for us. And that just introduced me to Miami history, and in particular Black Miami history. I'm the lucky guy that got to do this and continue to write about it and tour it and what have you. It's just it's one of these serendipitous things. But I will tell you, the shocked look on the face of professors when they read that chapter about what black relations were like 100 years ago and more, and 100 years ago and less in Miami, it was like, this can't be happening.
Yeah.
There was a couple of lynchings. It was just unbelievable. Reuben Stacy in Fort Lauderdale, as late as 1935, was lynched.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and wrap this up. First of all, I do want to say, as the filmmaker and Joanna as well, that it's a privilege to be able to be a part of that story, to be able to help put those stories together and put it out there. I think the only way that things change is when we understand the story of our fellow man and fellow woman. All of the stories are important. And when we have that understanding, we can work together as a community as a whole to make a better society. So I want to thank Miramar Chief of Police, Delrish Moss. I'm proud of you. Dr. George, parents, Joanna. By the way, it's our anniversary today. And it's Emilio's birthday. So we have some cake in there. We want everybody to go grab some cake and enjoy. If you don't get a chance to see the film, it will be shown again on PBS. So just look for your local listings. If you're in Palm Beach, it's going to be on April 13th on WXEL at 8 p.m. So thank you very much for South Florida PBS for hosting this event. Thank you everybody for coming. We appreciate it.